Hi, everyone.
Hello.
Hello. Cool, yep, they're working. Neat.
Okay, we might get started so we don't run too late because we've timed this a few times and it changes time each time, which is an interesting sign.
Love that.
Welcome to the writing, workflow and game design sort of panel. We'll explain what that means in a second. So I'm Paris, this is Tim, this is John. We are from Tasmania. We are the Aussie cousins that are tilting the playing field, apparently, according to the keynote, the opening before the keynote this morning, which is, friendly but good. From our perspective, you guys and girls and everyone else are doing fantastic things as well. We are the team behind Yarn Spinner, which is one of the more popular narrative game development tools, but not the only one. We're also really well known for working on Night in the Woods and a bunch of other games. So we're here to talk to you about narrative game development with the help of some friends. Ryan, Krita, Scott and Lena, who you'll meet shortly via the magic of technology. But before we get into the panel content, we're going to kick over to Tim, who's going to give you a little bit of an introduction to things that kind of sets the stage. And this is the way we're going to structure it today. Tim's going to tell you about the state of narrative tools.
Okay, hi. So yes, as Paris said, I'm going to give you sort of a 10-ish minute talk on a bit of an update on the state of narrative tools as far as I see them. Hello, I'm Tim. As we said before, I'm an independent game developer from Hobart. It's actually very similar to Wellington in many respects. It's a lot smaller, but the coffee's actually good. That's right, I said it. No, the coffee's fine here. It's okay. So what is this talk going to be about? This is going to be just a quick look at narrative tools as far as I can see them. And not so much about narrative tools, but more the way we're using those tools to make games. Because tools are boring, what you do with them is what's interesting. So why does this talk exist? This talk exists because it's actually something I do roughly once a year anyway. Because I work on a narrative game tool, it would be irresponsible of me to not be looking into what people are trying to do with narrative game tools. This is only the second time ever I've had to put it into coherent structure and thoughts. The last time was actually last year for NZGDC, where we were remote instead of in person. The focus on this is going to be at the indie sort of scale. That's mostly because that's what I have insight into. Some of this may apply to AAA. I just have less insight. I know less AAA people, and my understanding is they do more custom stuff anyway. So I apologize if you're all from AAA studios, but I kind of doubt that. So there is a really big caveat here. I'm a programmer. I'm not a writer. I may be the worst writer you've ever met. But the thing is, you want programmers interested in narrative tools and games. You want us interested in narrative tools and games because otherwise you won't have people to make the tools to help you make the games. So you want us interested in them. But that is just a warning. I do tend to get excited, going, oh, I can model this with graph theory. And writers are like, why would I care? So what is the main vibe of this little mini talk here? So what are people asking for? What are people doing? So I would actually say the main vibe is we're actually getting really good at telling the main story with our tools. No matter what the structure, no matter what the tool is, we're pretty comfortable at telling the story the way we want. And that's because I think we're getting more comfortable with the tools, whether that be like yarn, whether that's twine, that's ink, fungus, whatever you're using, we're getting more comfortable with them. Or rather, we're getting a lot more comfortable with our ability to beat them into shape. Now, my reasoning for this is I'm actually seeing a lot less people go, I had to do this terrible hack to make this thing work, and more, oh, we just did it this way when discussing things, which I think is sort of a side effect of the tooling heavily maturing and people maturing along with the tools. What we really want, however, is better integration of the world and all of the side quests into the main story. We want to build up the secondary narrative in a more coherent way. We want the barks and the little world that's built around it to feel like it's more part of the world and less out of the place. We basically want better world and story integration, the secondary and tertiary narrative to reflect this. There's a really good quote here by Borat Pfeiffer, who I hope I haven't mispronounced his name there. If you shoot the sheriff but not the deputy, eventually the deputy is going to become the sheriff and come after you. So that's the sort of the general idea. You want the world to feel a little bit alive. This is actually nothing new. People have been making enormous semi-coherent narrative worlds for a while and been trying new ways. I actually think probably the best approach that you can do is the one taken by Star Wars and Star Trek, which is you just throw literally thousands of writers at it. You can make an enormous coherent world, semi-coherent world, relatively easily. You just need billions of dollars. So that is one very valid approach. I don't think it's valid for most of us, unfortunately. So you're going to have to do something that's a little bit generative, a little bit procedural, which what that means will change depending on your game and what you need to do. One term that I've seen, which I really liked, was you were going to be having bespoke plus procedural narrative. So rarely do you want a game that's just purely procedural generated stories. That tends to be pretty limiting pretty quickly. You still have a story you want to tell that will be heavily hand-authored and under your control. But you want this world built up around it, and you'll need help with this. And as with many trends, this is nothing new. I would actually argue this started in 1992 with Chris Crawford's Dragon speech. That's kind of what he was leaning towards. It's just now we actually have a bit more tech and a bit more understanding around how to do these things. In particular, Emily Short, who if you haven't read her blog, you should read her blog. She has this great quote, which was from a GDC talk actually this year, I think. Not going, I want to let this run and see what happens, more how are we supporting the player's action? So again, tying into that thing, you have a story you want to tell, you just want the player to feel like they're more of a part of it. So how are people actually doing this? So the first thing, I'm going to talk about a few different sort of techniques that I'm seeing an increase in use of, but it's really, really important to say none of these are used in isolation. They're all mixed together. If you use them in isolation, you end up with very weird things, so you can't. The first thing is actually generators. These are probably the oldest ones out there. Actually, has anyone heard of Tracery? Just put your hand up if you've heard of Tracery. There's a few hands, cool. So basically what you have with these is you have a grammar, so you've defined some sort of structure for lines that you want to be later presented, and then you'll pass over values or game state to these lines, and then it generates new ones for you. And even though it's a really simple thing, I personally am really blown away by just how simple even going like, wow, I can't believe you went to last place you did, has an impact on you being like, hey, the game remembered I went there. And so this is actually an example here. Yeah, that looks all right. Well, it looks all right from this distance. Always never sure how things look on screens. Of Tracery. Tracery is quite old now by Kate Compton, who does a bunch of really interesting natural language research. So basically the idea is here is you've got these lines. You want it to generate new lines, swapping out the variables look and name effectively at random. And this is the most basic sort of Tracery example you could create. If you were to run this and go, hey, Tracer, give me a new line, it'll swap out the values and go, hey, Tim, you're looking hungry. Or it might go like, hey, John, you're looking tired. Or hey, Paris, you're looking excited. This only has 9 possible combinations, so it would tap out pretty quickly. But you can see how you could build these things out very quickly. My actual favorite example of that currently, of a game that uses this approach, it doesn't use Tracery, but it uses an approach very similar, is actually the new Crusader Kings. Where it creates entirely amazing little like story slices just by swapping out values of characters and events and places that you as the controlling faction person is doing to tell these little stories. It does a really good job at that. And if you're curious, check out Tracery, or there's a Unity specific thing called Blabber. There's links at the end. So the next approach is filters and sifters, which is at its core basically tagging every single piece of dialogue you write. You tag it as villain, you tag it as location, you tag it as place, time, whatever you need to tag it as for your game. And then at runtime you go like, hey, I need a new villain story, and it'll go through and grab one. And again, you'll generally have it in combination with some of those generators where it'll be swapping out values. The really cool thing about this is you can also tag all your assets. So you can tag your models, villains, your locations, etc. And then when you're building these up, you can actually grab these assets out to also fill out the world. A really good example of this, which came out very recently, is Weird West. If you haven't played it, I think it's available on everything. I'm sure it's available on everything. Their entire game is basically built up out of this approach, where they have these little story, they call them vignettes, where they build out little tiny story slices and assemble them together to tell their overall story. There isn't really much of a big narrative. It's lots of little narratives all bolted together through tagging. Then you hit the hard bit, which is where you have to draw the rest of the owl. Unfortunately, what these approaches give you is the story atoms, the individual pieces of your story. It's up to you to work out how to assemble them, when to assemble them, how they evolve, if they need to evolve, and every game has their own completely independent approaches, sadly. So, for example, in Master the Rose, they had a system which was designed to increase dialogue juiciness, is how they described it, which is where it would pick options for the AI to say based on the number of conflicting things that it would cause to you. Other options include using narrative planners or wayfinding algorithms. Unfortunately, there isn't any sort of commonality here. Every game seems to have their own completely unique approach. Happy to talk about it later, but there isn't a trend in this one. Now, the next thing I want to briefly talk about, which is sort of related, is this is a term coined by, I believe Max Kraminski coined it as part of their work into emergent narrative. The core idea here is these are games less you want to experience the story as written and more you just want to play through the weird stories it creates for you. They're called instruments because the idea is like you're having a jam session. You know, you play a song on a guitar, it sounds differently than if you play a song on a piano. You're enjoying the music, the story music that the game is creating. Two examples from the original research into this is Dwarf Fortress, specifically its Legends mode, if you haven't played that, where it builds out like a story of ages that you can lightly influence and explore and visualize. And their other really good example is Blaseball, which if you haven't played, you should play Blaseball. Blaseball is very interesting in that your influence is very minimal in that game and everyone is experiencing the same weird story instrument, unlike most of these story instruments where you can generate millions of these stories to go through them. My actual favorite examples, though, are AI language models. I love playing with like open AI's GPT-3 because it's just so stupid. I love playing with AI Dungeon just because it creates the most random things. My actual favorite example, you don't have to read these, I just put them up there because I thought they're funny. They're bagging out that Google employee who thought his chat program was alive. The reason I like that is specifically because it shows, and this is the point Max Kraminski's trying to make here, humans love stories. We love stories so much, we will do anything to make sure there is a story, even if we have to assemble one out of millions of little tiny pieces. We're really good at narrative repair. We like stories so much, we'll do anything to see one, even if we have to go, yeah, my AI's alive. So in summary, we're actually pretty happy with our ability to tell the story that we want. We want better tooling and better support to integrate a more sort of holistic approach to your story and the player's actions in the world. We're also seeing a bit more interest in narrative instruments being picked up as tools that people want to play with. A few other random things which are really cool that have happened over the past year but didn't have time to sort of fit into the main story. Inform is open source, which if you've never used any of the Inform tools, you should check it out. It's open source now, it's free, it's great. Ink has an official guide, which I was reading. It's actually quite good. It's like $10, buy it, it's great. Yarn Spinner has a VS Code extension now, which lets you actually like link your Unity code and your Yarn code together better. Is Fungus dead? Like, legit question. Issues are piling up. I'm really concerned with that one because it's a pretty cool tool. So last year I bagged out Unreal for not really having any good conversation tools. And then it was pointed out to me they've actually had a conversation system since February last year. I generally have no idea how this works. It looks super complex. I've spoken to some Unreal people that either never heard of it or also didn't know how it works. So I'm still going to say Unreal's unfortunately bad at this and you're going to have to build it yourself. Narrowscope conference ran for the first time in a few years, which is great. There's a bunch of really good videos there about narrative in games. They're all up on YouTube, check them out. Hannah Nicklin, who is lead writer on Mutazione, wrote a book. I haven't actually read it yet because they want $70 for an EPUB and I'm not paying that much money for an EPUB, so I'm going to wait till I can get a paper copy. And that's my little mini section done. Now we're going to advance.
Right, so with everyone up to date on all the things that Tim has told us about, now we're going to have a bit of a chat about how people approach working in narrative games, how they plan for that, all the challenges they face doing that. So we're going to actually do our actual panel, which I'm going to click. So to do an actual panel, what we had to do last year, because we got blocked from coming to Wellington at the very last minute, thanks to some very sensible COVID policies, so we weren't that bitter about it, it was just sad. Last year we put together a panel in kind of a documentary form where we interviewed people and it got aired in this room and we weren't here. So we were watching on a very tiny screen back at home, being very sad that we were not here, but it kind of worked out well. And we decided to do a similar thing again, even though we are physically here in person. So we had a bit of an unstructured chat with a bunch of really interesting game developer people who sadly themselves cannot be here at NZGDC for a variety of reasons. Hopefully one day we'll get to do this kind of panel in person. And we asked them, you know, how they approach narrative game development, how they use tooling, what sort of approaches they take, what problems they face, and all sorts of stuff like that. So we're going to show you a video which will quickly introduce our participants and then we'll start talking through some of their points.
Hi, I'm Ryan North and I'm a writer for comics and games and all sorts of stuff.
Hi there, I'm Kridelas Heikki. I'm a narrative designer from Helsinki, Finland, and I currently work at Skunkworks Games, and I'm also a recent graduate from Aalto University.
I'm Scott Benson. I'm a creative director at Glory Society. I was a writer, artist, and co-director on a game called Night in the Woods.
Hi, I'm Lena Van Deventer. I'm creative producer and writer at Rubin Games working on Dead Static Drive. And I'm a teacher and feminist about town, all those things as well. But yeah, I've been in game dev for about 10 years now, which is a daunting number.
That is a daunting number. So those are our fantastic participants. So you'll hear from them throughout our little panel today. They're all our friends, and we're really thrilled to have them participate in this little talk with us.
So first we thought we really wanted to just go like, hey, how do you get started? How do you get over that blank piece of paper problem, basically?
So the first thing that came up when we asked them how they get started was that you can't just start with a story. You have to start with the fact that you're making some sort of story for a game. So the media dictates the process. So we had a little bit of a chat about that with them.
Tools do really direct where stories go. So it's not like you have like a concept and a story and then go, okay, let me spin the wheel of mediums. I could write a novel, or I could make a movie, or I could make a Broadway musical, or I can make a video game. I'll pick that. It's like, no, I make video games. Therefore, that's where I can tell stories, kind of thing.
I'll start with a pitch to the editor, which is a couple paragraphs of here's what I want to have happen. Then, assuming they approve it, I do an outline, which is about a page per issue. Here's what I want to happen. This is written only for me, because then I'll need to go and flesh that out into, say, 20 pages. So it's basically going from super high level to the level at which you produce a written comic, where I've written the dialogue and I've written the scene descriptions.
I do kind of want to see Scott Benson do a Broadway musical, but that's, yeah, I think that'll be amazing. Ryan's obviously talking about his work in comics there, but the medium dictates what you actually need to write, obviously.
So the main difference between games and other media is that you can explore games in a much more literal sense than in other media. And our panelists thought so too.
Yeah, one of the beauties of interactive media is you usually have a lot of space. You need the space because you're following through on different choices. And so usually for me, it's a lot more of a process of exploration.
One of the reasons I like narrative games is because the text and the dialogue feels like exploration as well. Like, I'm not someone who like is big into like role playing. Like, I want to be like, no, I'm interested in what this author's point of view was in this character that they wrote.
I'll have an idea of where I want the spine of the story to go, and then I'll start exploring the ways that could go. I developed this technique while working on my books of interactive fiction, Romeo and or Juliet, and To Be or Not to Be, interactive Shakespeare books. And for that, I had the spine, the story that Shakespeare wrote. And the meat of it was me coming up with alternate paths. What would happen if you did this or that? So it's much more a holistic process of exploration then. And I've continued that into games, where when I'm writing dialogue, I'll know maybe you want 3 to 4 choices here. What could those choices be? How could they be meaningfully different? And if they are meaningfully different, which bring you to interesting places?
So what I really found interesting about this was, even though they both saw exploration as the main sort of key difference between games and other narrative, is that Ryan saw it as a way of exploring the story space, to create the story space, whereas Scott saw it as a way of exploring the story space as written, which I thought was really fascinating. They both came to the same conclusion through a completely different approach.
So these days in game design, the words ludonarrative dissonance are kind of tossed around as these days a bit of a punchline. But what that term represents, the idea that the story and the gameplay must be in some kind of harmonious synchrony, is a legit concern. You do need to make them align, especially when you're in the early stages of narrative development.
What I'm doing is kind of making sure that these separate areas that were perhaps not narratively designed to go together start going together.
Knowing what kind of a game it is, like what you're doing mechanically, like what the general like form of the game is super important. I don't think that I've been able to have a story and then go, okay, what kind of game will it be? Usually it's like, hey, no, those things tend to work together.
We had to figure out a way not only to to decide on what the content would be, but to decide which of those would work in a sort of a big cohesive group, you know. So with that, we had to sort of go all the way back to theme, and we used Zach McClendon's big board technique that he gave a NYU talk in, I think, 2017. And it's really great about getting, all of the things there for a reason, and for really being deliberate, and what creative promises are you making, and what cultural values are informing it, and all that sort of a way to sort of square off whether something was working or not, or whether something fit, and whether something had a narrative reason for existing.
So figuring out how those themes work together between what you're doing in the game and how we're presenting it, and then the story we're telling, that's like core. That has to immediately work. Once that happens, you can kind of immediately sort of get your like sort of emotional beats. And at this point, I have like a notebook and I'm just writing.
I find it like the most important thing is like, how can I build a narrative that like supports the player's understanding of what they're supposed to do. And especially in mobile games, that's a really like important part of the process because, well, from a business side, we're really concerned with keeping all the players that like the game playing as much as possible. And so as a narrative designer, as a writer, you have a really important role in
So something that I find really interesting is I think as we're seeing more and more like books and TV shows and movies being adapted into other mediums, I actually think we're seeing a lot of criticism, which is that, but for non-games. I think we're seeing a lot of like pictorial narrative dissonance, especially like things like the Cowboy Bebop remake, which most of the complaints are like, it's all right, but it's not what it should be. And I think that's mostly because they adapted it to a new medium that it was never designed for. So I think it may actually be transcending games. It's just we're ahead of the curve for once, so suck at other art.
Maybe the medium is the story. So we need to go from the realm of pure ideas and actually create a plan for building things. And we had a bit of a chat about how our panelists went from the very high level to the very practical. And this is what they had to say.
As it starts to get more solidified, then I'll open up the Google Docs and start going, okay, here's what this game is, here's what it's about. And I'll usually write out, here's what this game is doing mechanically, here's what we want to do with it, like thematically with this kind. Here's what it's doing story-wise, here's what it's doing mechanically, here's why those two things work together. And I'll usually write it out and go, this works with this because together they do this, and this is the thesis of this game, essentially.
So it's of course really, let's say, luxurious if you get to be part of the process at the really early stage. That hasn't necessarily always been my case.
Yeah, so I think my normal approach is to look at the constraints and affordances of the team, the role, and the content, and then sort of work out what the deliverables would be. Agree on those with, the team, and then pump them out. Yeah.
You're kind of in a place where like a lot of the things are already built. You feel like you're, laying the tracks as the train is already running.
That makes you make a lot of mechanical decisions based on that. So I think figuring out what is your character good at, what are they comfortable with, and what are they not very good at, automatically makes you make all kinds of sort of decisions. And that's why early on, when we're working on a game, those decisions are, at least for me, really foundational.
When you're in a scrappy team with not many people, you just have to kind of make it work, right? Everyone's wearing 12 hats and everyone's, you've got tools programmers doing this and got that, and, I'm doing sound, some sound stuff soon, and it's like, you just have to get it done. You just have to figure out a way to make it work,
I think most of us can reflect on the fact that everyone wears multiple hats in game development, and I think most narrative designers are probably often designing game mechanics as well, so they're game designers, and they're often also making tools. Everyone has to wear a billion hats to make projects work.
So a really important part of making it work is to find the voice of your characters, and two of our panelists actually had the exact same one weird trick for doing that.
It's a good weird trick.
So I live in an area where I can take a walk in the forest and I can talk to myself and not feel too embarrassed about it.
The trick I have for that is you put on a headset like this one with a mic in front so everyone knows you're on a very important call and you're a very important person. And I take my dog for a walk and I talk out loud to myself.
And that is usually like a great way for me to sound out like, how does this sound? But also when I'm walking, that keeps my brain going at a good pace.
So I will try to do character voices. I will try to figure out dialogue, like what these people sound like, figure out plot, ask myself questions. The reason I do that is if you're just thinking, I found at least, thinking out loud, it's very easy to get distracted, and you don't necessarily, think in your head rather, it's very easy to get distracted and you don't necessarily finish thoughts because you can go off on tangents too easily.
But it depends, of course, on the person. Like some people might be able to do that just sitting at their computer, and that's also nice.
And once I'm settled on what I want this thing to be, that's where I actually do the digital creation of writing and not just walking my dog and calling it work. And the headset is to make me look like an important business person and not to feel embarrassed or ashamed about walking around the city talking to myself. No one looks at you if you look like you're really big and important.
I will admit that at some point when I've done this, I've just taken out my phone from my pocket as if I'm talking into it when someone else comes.
This process can be so effective at engaging your writer brain that the one time that Ryan did this, he ended up trapped in a hole at the local skate park with his dog, and it made the news. Polygon wrote an article about it.
So the thing that was sort of reiterated a lot was in the early stages, the tools and the team have to work together. But the interesting thing is the team influences the tools, which then influence the team, which influence the tools, which influence the team, so on and so on, like some sort of disgusting snake monster eating its own tail. And they were all very happy to talk about that.
For linear content, I start with just plain text. Text editor, it's where I do all my work. Nothing fancy, no bolds, no underlines, just text. And I will get the script to a point where I'm happy with it in that format. And then I look to what they want. Do they want a Word document? Do they want a final draft script? Whatever, however they format it, I'll then copy that into that format. And it is a little bit of extra work. Sometimes it takes a lot of time to like put the formatting in. But it's also a sanity check. It's me rereading the script. I'll make alterations there. It's usually a day or two later. I try to build that into the time so I can look at it with fresh eyes. After I've done that pass and put it in the format that they expect, that's when I send it off.
Things like mirror boards can be super useful. And then for kind of understanding how to structure narrative things, I find making charts is really a good tool, either using like Miro or Lucidchart or just Illustrator or whichever tool you find is the easiest for making things that are basically post-it notes, but in a format that is easier to share with your team.
Behind me here, you can't see it because it's so sunny right at this time of day in our new studio, but there's a map there with a lot of cards in each town to say what's going to be happening in each of those towns.
When I'm writing with other people, if I'm part of a team, then that's where you do need this structure that everyone agrees with, everyone understands, and that's where you'll bring in things like here's a whiteboard, here's a beat chart, all that sort of stuff is useful, I find, for communicating with other writers. But when I've got my slice of the story for myself, I've never done it. I've just done point form. This happens, and this, then this, then this, to get it all straight in my head before I start writing.
And that is, for me, that is because I know the members of my team don't want to read long treatments of anything, and they also don't want to sit in long meetings where I'm explaining really long things.
And especially to a writer who takes the meaning of words very seriously, it can sometimes be a bit of an issue in how things are named. That sounds really like persnickety and kind of catty, but words really mean things, and I'd really like if writers and programmers could sort of sit together and workshop the best, terms that they could be using.
This point about programmers and writers needing to be on the same page for terms is something that we'll return to a couple of times.
So we're pretty happy with our understanding of how people get started with a narrative game and kind of approach their planning or design process for a project. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to chat a bit about the details of how they actually plan that out.
So narrative designers need to understand the process of what they're planning before they can dive in and start working with the rest of the team, because being able to get an early understanding of your narrative goals is as essential as producing that plan in the first place.
So in the process of making Night in the Woods, like I said, we were kind of like learning as we went, and there wasn't a lot of I was initially surprised that there was not like a standard industry, here's the program we all use for this, and realizing, no, actually, everyone uses something different.
I think it's quite common among game writers and narrative designers to say that no two jobs are alike, but there are some similarities there. It definitely is starting to look like it is a specific profession to be a game writer and a slightly different one to be a narrative designer. But then there are kind of these clouds of different tasks that can go together.
I know that never once have I been able to use the same workflow twice, in any job that I've had in games. So, you do have to be flexible and sort of figure out how to be water and fill those gaps and figure out what's required of you and how to do the work.
So for interactive content, you don't want to be working in plain text. That only works for very simple interactivity. Generally, I try to use a specialized tool for it. So anything that lets me put words in boxes and draw lines between those boxes, that's kind of all I need.
And one of the goals as early on as possible is get it so that you can see some version of the whole thing in a shape, in a visual sense, in a code sense, in however you want to do it, make it so that you can look at it and go, okay, that's the thing. You need to be able to see what the thing is.
And then I'll build that out, and at that point, I will make sure that the tool I'm using can generate the script in the format that the people expect. So I won't do that translation phase, doing interactivity because it's too much work.
So something that I thought was very interesting is they all reiterated how you basically need everyone to be on the same page, whatever that page had to be. And that's a point that is sort of recommunicated several times, which I thought was very interesting.
So, of course, we all produce all sorts of garbage when we build video games. The artifacts that we produce, documents, spreadsheets, flowcharts, and so on, they're all incredibly important garbage, not just for thinking it through, but for also communicating what the hell you're actually doing to the rest of your team, even if the rest of your team is you on a different day when you've forgotten what you did the previous day. So we were fortunate enough to have a bit of a chat about our participants' use of such planning documents. So let's take a look.
We have sort of a three-pronged approach. We're doing this project in Unreal, so we've made a sort of narrative state machine for Unreal called Novella to sort of have the high-level story elements being taken care of at an engine level. So sort of we want the storyline to be opt-in and for the player to get exactly as much story as they want, nothing more, nothing less.
And so I ended up with a whole lot of different big flowcharts. This is one of them that we're looking at. This whole doc is kind of structured where we have our one big line of our sort of critical path. They were outlined this way so that we could kind of better communicate them with multiple members of the team, as opposed to me just going, and then this happens.
We use flowcharts to begin with. That's sort of a base storyline for each ensemble NPC character. So not every NPC has a storyline, but there's about 50 of them that do. And we use draw.io for that because it's just a nice little tidy free thing in a browser that works really well. It seems really robust and really powerful.
Doing something like this does give you an idea of like, wow, there's a lot of that box over and over again. Maybe we should cut one of those. That seems like a lot. Because now that we've done one of those in the game and I know how long that takes, we really don't need 5 of these. We could really go by with 3 or 4 of these. That's fine.
We then put it into storyline graphs from there, which has a bit more engine information in it. That's sort of based around an Unreal plugin called Generic Graph. And the storyline graph lets us sort of paint the big picture of how a character's life changes depending on player intervention.
Kind of just wrote out little blurbs about some of them down here where it says friendship quest. And what's funny is that the shorter they were, the more I already had a really specific idea of what it was. If I'm writing out a lot of it, it's because I'm working this out as I'm writing it. And so the longer ones that seem like, wow, that's really planned out. It's like, no, that means it's less planned out because if it was, then it's like oh no, he doesn't know what he's doing.
And from there, we have all the info we need to get into blueprints and get, the actors moving around and sort of act like a director and move my little people around to sort of break it down into scenes and conversations. That makes it easier to implement for me as well if we can set up more of a template because I don't have a programming background.
If you can communicate that to the rest of the team and you can kind of parse that yourself, it can be like really, really helpful because I've been chipping away at parts of this, but I can't see the whole thing yet.
I'm not a programmer, I'm not very talented at this, but I can implement at this level. Once you've got the storyline stuff and the flowchart, then I can make up the rest for sure.
I really like the fact that Scott acknowledges that the plan document was both a communication tool for him as a team, but also his own personal scratch pad to try and figure out pretty key elements of the story. So like any other project, there are going to be bumps in the road that you need to watch out for. And when we asked our panelists about things that they'd run into in past projects, a couple of pretty consistent themes emerged. It's rarely done maliciously or even on purpose, but as a writer, you can end up quite isolated from the rest of the decisions that end up affecting what you need to do. And you're often the person who has to glue those things back together when the requirements change.
Most of the time when I've been working for video games, it has been pretty siloed. So there'll be technical requirements for what these scripts need to look like, but it's not like they'll consult with me on the character designs or the voice actors bringing these characters to life. Sometimes they do, but generally they don't. And that's fine.
As a narrative person, you're always like trying to like make sure you have the resources, and sometimes you have to be able to argue for those resources to get to do what you want to do.
When they're casting voice actors, when they're doing concept art, when they're building engines, they're not super concerned generally with what does the writer think about this.
You have to like be able to actually like again argue to do that.
Because if they've done their job right, they know the size of the box that I'm in, they have the technical specs on what the script's going to look like, and that's kind of all they need from me. They're leaving the narrative to the narrative guy, and we'll handle the art and everything else with those teams.
So live games, it comes with a little bit of complications compared to when you have, you're working on your normal game making process, your pre-production, you're planning your story, and then you go into maybe production and you're working on making it all happen. On a live game, you have to do all of this within a month. And because you have this like quite tight window here, you can't quite afford during that week of ideation to go, oh no, I have no ideas, I can't do this. You can't get writer's block then. Or you can, and then you just don't deliver the thing that you're going to deliver. Which, you can choose to do that as well.
I worked on one project, which was eventually canceled, where I sent them a pitch for what we're going to do. They loved it. I started writing that, and then they had different ideas of different ways it could go. And when you start changing the shape of the container, you're changing the nature of the writing, and you're changing the nature of the project.
You'd finally, piece together the puzzle, and you're like happy with it, and then you're like, oh, so now this whole thing doesn't exist, and instead we have this other thing, and now I have to like piece it together in a different way, basically.
All that sort of stuff, when you're changing the nature of the interactive project when you're writing, it's really difficult to adapt to that.
If it's a process where things are happening super rapidly, then you're gonna have a bit of like feeling like you're never quite in the room where it happens, where you're supposed to be.
You can imagine a video game that was supposed to be an interactive novel becoming a shooter. You can still have the same plot, but it's going to be explored in very different ways. And you're not going to want to sit around in an action game and read pages of text the way you would in an interactive novel.
So something that was, we have so much more content that we could give an entire talk just on changing the constraints, but I do like how the main issue that kept coming up was basically the poor narrative team keeps getting kicked out of the room where the decisions need to be made, and I think that's actively something I at least need to be more wary of.
So there is another issue, which is omnipresent in video game development, also other technical fields, which is jargon. It's probably not malicious, although this is the video game industry. It might be malicious, who knows. Jargon can be a big problem. So our participants had a bit of a chat about that.
Early on, and I think even up until recent years, I'm kind of over it now, but I think at first I was kind of embarrassed a lot. I was kind of like, everyone else knows more than me. I feel very stupid, and I feel like I shouldn't need tools because other people don't.
Programmers and writers are sometimes speaking completely different languages. And sometimes, in the speed of naming something, functions of verbs and this and that, and like, I get that, but sometimes in someone's haste to quickly name and build something, they forget that it might mean something else to someone else, and especially to a writer who takes the meaning of words very seriously. It can sometimes be a bit of an issue in how things are named.
There's a lot of technical shorthand and stuff. It's like when you finally do understand it, you're like, oh, no, that makes perfect sense.
It can be kind of, let's say, alienating if you're like kind of new to the industry and you read a game job ad, because some of the language in there might not say anything to you.
The jargon and a lot of the technical know-how you need ends up being a little bit more of an arcane art.
Because programmers shouldn't be allowed to name things, but let the writers do this for you.
It's not on you if you don't know this. This is some really inside baseball shit, and I would love to define this for you so that you also know these secret weird words that might be helpful and stuff.
But I don't want to see it as being like, let's say like explicitly like gatekeeping or someone trying to keep people outside. I think it might more be that the day-to-day language when we're speaking to other developers. We try to find the common denominator.
And this has been a running thing with my entire career that I had to really get over, is assuming that if I can do it, it's easy. And not in the sense of like, well, if I can do it, you can do it. It's me going, no, if I can do it, then it must be unbelievably stupid and easy. And everyone can do it.
In mobile games especially, there's so much jargon around, around the business side of things. It's just jargon all the way through.
I think a lot of tools could benefit from using language that writers are already using instead of using language that programmers think would work or that they have been using.
If you're not in that discussion, it's really hard to get into as well.
So much of it is just trying to put it together, what these people are calling it and what I'm trying to call it.
Jargon's one of those things that it's as useful as it is problematic. It's a natural outgrowth of people with expertise, and it helps them communicate effectively, but it also keeps people who aren't in the know out of the loop.
So to finish up, we thought when we were doing our interviews with them, we thought we'd go through a bunch of tools as like, hey, what do you think about Twine? What do you think about Yarn? What do you think about Ink? What do you think about Fungus? What do you think about, like, go through all of them. But what it turned out is as soon as you ask people about Twine, they start by going, I like Twine, but actually, and then they'll go off on a rant, and it turns out Twine is actually a fantastic tool for extracting writers' needs from what they want from a tool, because everyone knows Twine, essentially.
So Twine is for me the kind of like narrative engine / tool that I've probably used actually the most.
It's great to learn on and to sort of do your first couple of projects that can explode your brain.
And what just like draws me into it every time is that it's just so simple and it's still quite versatile.
Students tend to take to it really quickly, which I think is a testament to the design of that UI.
I have used Twine for interactive projects before. I find it stands a little bit between me and the work. And there's no easy way to get the output in a format that's generally required.
I find I get pretty bored of it pretty quick.
It works, and I've used it, but just for me, my preference is closer to the realm of pure ideas, and Twine for interactive video games feels like a little bit of a barrier between what I'm trying to do and what it wants me to do, because it's not actually built for that purpose necessarily.
The thing I yet haven't found a good solution for is like preloading graphics into Twine, which can make basically like any place where you're going from one link to another can be quite a janky experience for the player.
So I'm making this sound like I'm a capital W writer who goes into his writer's cave and puts on a suit and says, now I must create. It's not. I just don't want the tools to be fighting me even a little. And when the tools are fighting you, it slows you down and it distracts you, and it's not something that I try to avoid it if I can.
In my mind, it's always better to sort of go with what comes sort of easy with the tool than put a lot of effort into like fighting the tool.
It's too big a topic. It's very huge. There's 1,000 different little tools that you need. Like, no one has come up with the really great, here is the way that you visualize all of this.
It's not so much the tools that have had the biggest impact on me, but the access to, the wider high level kind of aspect of things. So I think with small teams, like I used to say, and I still do say it to a certain extent, I used to say things like, you don't have to learn programming to be a writer, and you don't. But God, you are so much cheaper and for the company if you can.
It's what you're saying. Twine's actually great. I think it's because it's so well known and so well used. It's a very good starting point for, hang on, what's wrong with the tooling?
Thanks, everyone. That's the end of our panel. Thanks to our fantastic panelists. They were really, really good sports for participating. Let's hope we can actually bring some of them here next time. That would be brilliant. So thanks to Ryan, Krita, Scott, and Lena. They did an amazing job. If you want to find us, you can find us on Twitter. We are a large portion of the Yarn Spinner Tool team, and also the rest of our Twitter handles are there. And we have a Discord, which is more of a general narrative game Discord in some ways than it is just for Yarn Spinner. If you enjoyed this, we did a similar thing last year, which is on YouTube on the NZGDA channel, which is worth watching if you like this, because it's pretty much the similar thing with a different set of panelists, so there's some overlap there. We also have a page of links, which is everything we mentioned today on that page. I think almost everything we mentioned.
Yeah, so this is the one to take the photo of or to scan the QR code. This actually goes to a page that contains links to every single thing that was mentioned in all of this thing, both Tim's initial section and also things that our panelists mentioned even as an offhand remark.
If we missed one, let us know and we can put it up there because we do have a big page of links.
So I think we might have 5 minutes of questions, unless I'm completely wrong. And
Yeah.
there's microphones
Getting
here
nods.
and here if they're working. So if
Yeah.
anyone has a question, we can have a chat, but otherwise feel free to wave at us or sing or whatever it is you feel like doing.
Cool. Anybody have any questions? No questions? All right.
That's a good thing.
That means early lunch. So, all right. Thank you all again so much for coming. I hope that this was enjoyable. Thanks for having us.
Thanks so much.